Hi and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the American government before independence, the second section of the Origins of American Government lesson in your U.S. Civics course. My name is Paul. I am the social studies instructor here at Penn Foster High School. The best ways of getting in contact with us, you want to make sure that you certainly can call in 1-888-427-1000. There is an instructor option or academic help academic help line that you'd be able to choose and be able to get a little bit more assistance from myself or the other members of our educational team. From the help and support page, you are also able to reach us by email. And just from the same information or the message center that you receive from us about upcoming webinars and live help, you can use those as well. I actually just sent a message yesterday with the schedule for September. I am adding, not only do I have my civics webinars, I'm also going to be adding American history webinars. So if you are coming up to that course or have that in the future, feel free to take a look at that schedule and register for those. All webinars, if you do register, you will receive an email with the recording of them the following day. So it's really easy to register for the webinar. Even if you don't know for sure that you're going to be able to attend it live, you'll be able to get that recording the following day and then use a lot of different options of being able to get in contact with us again once you've attended that webinar, or once you've watched that webinar. You can call in, you can email, and now we are also adding a new feature of texting, as well as a new scheduler website, a tool that we're using for students to be able to set up times that you would like to be able to talk with us. We can call you at that time that you select, and we can go over any material that you're having trouble with or having any questions about your content. We are certainly available and willing and able to help you out. So there are a lot of good resources, a lot of good ways of being able to talk to us. Please use any tools, any resources that you need to be able to get those questions. As I mentioned, I am recording this webinar, so you'll receive it in an email tomorrow afternoon, so watch out for that. In that email, I'll also include the scheduler link for my social studies courses. So if you do have questions, you can certainly use those. And also, if you do have questions as we go through the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat on the webinar or right here on Go to Webinar. If I'm able to answer them throughout the webinar, I certainly will. Otherwise, if I need, otherwise at the end, I'll be more than happy to answer questions that you have. So let's get started with this webinar. Main objectives today. We'll be talking about the major points of the representative democracy, as well as the importance of the English Parliament and changes in the English government in general. Look at some of the types of our early American colonies and its governments, and be able to evaluate some of the early forms of protest in and at the start of the American Revolution. So we'll be covering a lot of material in this section of Origins of American Government. I won't be able to get to all of the material, but if you do have questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, you can certainly ask them in any of the other ways that I mentioned in the last slide, by phone, by email, by text, by setting up a schedule. Like I said, I'm willing to certainly answer any questions you have as we go along or as you go through your program. So as I mentioned, the English government, today we see it as very similar to the United States. It has representative democracy. It has it has a structure very similar to ours, some differences, but it wasn't always like that. It was an evolution. It started off for a long time as an absolute monarchy. And if you remember from the first section of the origins of American government. The absolute monarchy, the king and queen, particularly the king, has absolute power over the society and over the government. So, and this was the model of English government for a long time, and it starts kind of fading in the Middle Ages or at the end of the Middle Ages. So, really, for its several hundred years history before then, it is this absolute monarchy, and it starts fraying. It starts kind of being broken up a little bit when King John, in the end of the Middle Ages, begins to demand more taxes. Now, English society at the time is set up in which the king demands of his noblemen, of the lords of his kingdom, to collect taxes. And when the king demands not only taxes from the regular people, the commoners, he starts demanding more of his lords and of the rulers of different parts of his kingdom. The barons and the nobles, those who would usually be loyal to the king, have been loyal to the king, decide that they've had enough, and they raise an army. Think about this in terms of a civil war. We have civil wars going on most famously now in Syria in current history. America went through its civil war in 1861 to 1865. This almost becomes a civil war that the barons and the nobles raise their own army. Now, this is sort of a reason of the control that occurs in England, that really the king has not as much direct authority over commoners as the barons and these noblemen. The nobles and the barons, they have their army. They have their group that they use to enforce their rules. And it's the king who actually asks them for a lot of soldiers. If the king wants to go to war, he doesn't have his own army that he collects. He actually goes to the nobles and says, I want your army. I want your soldiers to come fight for me. So King John is a little rattled by this, and he comes willing to sign what's called the Magna Carta, or the major charter. And in the charter, it really focuses on the rights of the noblemen. The barons and the nobles are out for their own rights. They're not looking for rights of other people. And within this document, this charter, the noble class earns the rights to be able to have a jury of their peers. So the king is no longer able to set his own rules and is able to make his set up his punishment, and he's essentially the judge, jury, and executioner of any nobleman he finds as breaking a law of his. And now it becomes a jury of the peers, a jury of nobles and barons who are going to decide if someone broke the law. And it really starts putting into place the idea that the king is not above the law. For this time in world history, royal monarchs are considered above the law and are considered really the law. That we talked a little bit in the last webinar about the origins of American government. Kings and queens were seen as given their power by a god, by a godly creature or a godly figure, and they really used that in order to control their people. And kings like King John would use the same idea of the divine rights of kings to say, I'm your ruler because your God wanted me to be ruler. I do apologize. I just realized I did not leave the screen, or I did not make the screen live for you. So I do apologize for that. I will go back to the screen that I had for the communication or the forms of communication when we're all done with the webinar. So I do apologize for that. But so the kings have had this divine right, or have said that they have this divine right, and made even the nobles and the barons and the commoners as well loyal to them by saying, you know what, I'm ruling because God told me to. And this process after the Magna Carta starts breaking away this idea of the absolute monarch and the divine rights of kings. This is that big moment. Now, as I mentioned, the rights in the Magna Carta really only expand to the nobles. And it takes several more centuries for these same rights, the jury of peers, the respecting of the rule of law, that expands eventually to the rest of the citizens. So it doesn't happen quite yet. And that brings us to our first poll question. Whose rights were expanded initially in the Magna Carta? The kings, the nobles, all English citizens, or Parliament? Whose rights were expanded with this Magna Carta? Give you guys a few seconds here. I do apologize. I was having a little bit more technical difficulty. But here's the poll again. Whose rights were expanded initially after the Magna Carta? The kings, the nobles, the English citizens, all of them, or the Parliament? Whose rights were expanded with the Magna Carta? Another 10 seconds. Okay, finishing up in 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you so much. So it was the noble class. So the noblemen, the nobles and the barons were the ones who gained the rights in the Magna Carta. Eventually, we do see that all English citizens do earn these rights. And by extension, the colonists, American colonists, and other colonists around in the British Empire gain the rights eventually from this Magna Carta. Doesn't happen right away, though. So now we officially see the beginning of the end of the absolute monarch, and its next big challenge comes with the English Parliament. So as we come to the end of the Middle Ages, we just have the Magna Carta signed by King James. And while the Magna Carta, as the Magna Carta is being used by the nobles to expand rights, they also become more prominent in the government. And the king actually sets up a king's council that is primarily these noblemen, nobles and barons, who are able to advise the king on laws. They're still not getting authority to make rules or make laws, but it begins as this king's council. The council continues to grow with King Edward, and eventually they pass what's called the Confirmation of Charters, and this provides the power to Parliament to tax English citizens. So this is a big step in terms of English government. That it's no longer the responsibility or the job of the king to collect taxes. It is now the responsibility and authority of the Parliament. And this becomes significant because the king cannot choose to pass laws. He cannot choose to tax citizens. It is now the opportunity for the Parliament to say, you know what, we need more taxes. We need to pass more laws. Now at this time, the Parliament is still held by primarily the nobles and the barons. So it's not like today's world in which if the President of the United States wants to raise taxes or even lower taxes, he has to go through Congress, which is representative of typically, we don't have a noble class in the United States, but we do have, wealthier Americans. But Congress is supposed to represent all the American people. It's supposed to be elected by the American people. This is not quite the situation in England at this point. Parliament is still people who are appointed by the king, who are nobles, who gain their power by birth, by being in the family that they're in. But this is still a significant step, that there is this body of people, this parliament, who are deciding, not the king, but this group who is deciding on taxes. Parliament does become what's called a bicameral house, or Congress, in which there are two houses. The House of Lords is still generally these barons, church officials, the lords, the noble class. But then they create a lower house of more common people, still wealthier people, but not at the level of the barons and the lords and church officials. They are folks who have gained wealth by becoming merchants or being successful in their businesses. The next big moment of government change in England comes with the Glorious Revolution. This occurs when King James II tries to exert far more authority than he should be, in terms of taxation, in terms of rights of the British. And the Parliament is actually a huge part of this Glorious Revolution, in which there's not a real fight, there's not a war, but Parliament is able to help the nephew and niece of the king, William and Mary, become king and queen. So King James II is actually removed from office. He is considered exerting too much authority. It doesn't help now that he's a Catholic king, and more of England is becoming a more Protestant nation, becoming more of a nation that does not follow the rules of the Pope. And William and Mary become king and queen as Protestant rulers, and they make a deal with Parliament that the king and queen actually lose more of their authority. More of their authority goes to the Parliament. And they also create what's called the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights that we have is modeled very much off of the Bill of Rights of England. Now, unlike America, the Bill of Rights in England is not a set of codes or of laws. They are generally unwritten rules. They are generally rules that English government know that they're supposed to follow, but they're not written rules. But this is, again, a very significant step by the British in order to move towards a more unified country, or a more democratic or free country. Eventually, Parliament also gains a leadership post called the Prime Minister. In today's world, in today's England, it's the Prime Minister who has the largest authority in British government. They are the equivalent of a chief executive, of a president, but they are elected by the majority of the House of Commons. So this person is the leader of that political party. So in the United States, we have the Speaker of the House, who is the head of the majority in Congress, or in the House of Representatives. We have a leader in the U.S. Senate as the majority leader, but separate from them, there is the president, who is elected by the majority of Americans across the country. In Britain, they have in their House of Commons, their lower house, that group elects their leader, the Prime Minister of the country, and is shown then as the leader of that country. So that leads us to our next poll question. Let me see if I get this going. Here we go. All right. So what gave Parliament the power to tax? Was it the King's Council, the confirmation of charters, or the Glorious Revolution? What gave Parliament the power to tax? Give you guys about 10 seconds. Finish up in 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you so much. So it actually was the confirmation of charters. That confirmation of charters was passed, approved by the King of England to allow the Parliament the ability to tax. The King's Council was its original name as sort of a council to the kings of the Middle Ages. The Glorious Revolution certainly provides a lot of authority to the Parliament. Takes a lot of authority away from the king. The Parliament becomes the main government entity, organization. But it was that confirmation of charters that actually gave the power to tax the English to the Parliament. So now we're going to move into the colonies. So the English create their own government, or have now evolved into a more representative democracy. And those values, those ideas of representative government really don't just stay in England. As England expands its colonies, expands its reach over the course of the rest of the world, those values continue to spread. And we see that within our early colonies in the Americas, in the New World. And in general, America starts as originally as this land of immigrants. And the earliest of colonists, mainly from England or from Great Britain, were English-speaking. Just like the rest of England, they hold personal liberty very dear. Is a huge part of their government philosophy, their government thinking. They also have a huge concern over human rights. They want to make sure that just as England was protecting their own rights, the English colonists were concerned about wanting to protect their own rights, their human rights. And then that they also brought from England a view that government needed to be responsible. So as English citizens, before they left the colonies, they saw their parliament as their government, as the people that they represented. And they wanted to continue that when they moved into the New World, into these new colonies. And in general, they want to have these views, but they really have some struggles. When we get to the American history course in a few lessons, or in a few courses, I should say, you'll get a lot more of a sense of the struggles and the problems that occurred as these new English colonists moved into the New World. But Jamestown is really the first successful English colony. They see a lot of economic opportunity, primarily from farming crops like tobacco. And they begin to enslave, and after they, initially they were kind to Native Americans. They made deals with Native Americans. Eventually, they would start enslaving the natives. And they found that as they enslaved them, as they tried to get them to work on their crops, many of the Native Americans were dying from their diseases. So they actually decided to bring African slaves from their colonies in Africa, because they found that African slaves were far more resilient to European diseases. There's a long history of Europeans, and particularly Northern Africans, interacting with each other, going back to the Roman times. So these African slaves were far more tolerant to the diseases of English colonists. Now, climate, other diseases that were all right in the New World, those would cause problems for African slaves generally. But at the start, these African slaves were far healthier, far more able to work through the fields for Jamestown, and eventually the whole colony of Virginia, to become very successful. And as I mentioned, these immigrants, these groups of English colonists, came to America wanting and respecting personal liberty and human rights. So as soon as they were able to function as a society, as a new colony, they wanted to create a new government. And the first representative government in the colonies was the House of Burgess in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia. Now, as Virginia did begin as a corporate colony, the folks in Jamestown, the colonists who came later on, were making money as a corporation and really getting funding from the Virginia Company back in England. Well, as they became more and more successful, Parliament and the English government realized that, we can make we make good money from Virginia Company because of what they sell. We can make even more money if we take over the colony ourselves as a corporate or as a royal colony. So England decides to take the Virginia colony as a royal colony. Instead of the Virginia Company being in charge, it was now the Parliament and the King in charge of Virginia. And they create, along with the House of Burgess still had some authority, but the main authority in the colony was this Privy Council, which were advisors by the King. And they would enforce any rule that the king wanted to enforce. So this became the new government within Virginia. So you already see sort of a strain. Now the colonists eventually accepted this. They accepted the rule and even the king would eventually allow the House of Burgess to take on more authority. But there was, right from the start, sort of a conflict between the personal liberty that the colonists wanted and then the authority that the king wanted to have and the parliament wanted to have over the colonists. Other colonies was in Pennsylvania, where the Quakers, this religious group, wanted a colony. They were primarily interested in practicing their religion, being free to practice their religion, and the Quakers were uniquely tolerant. As most of the religious groups that came to the colonies, the Quakers were the most tolerant. They were the most tolerant of other Christian religions and also more tolerant of the Native American populations. So its founder, William Penn, really established a colony in order to make it free and in order to show a lot of tolerance across all the religious spectrum. In the Southern Colonies, which really encompassed, starting with Virginia down to Georgia, were primarily the sons of noble landowners. So they wanted to set out on their own track. They didn't want to stay in England and wait for their parents to essentially give them property. They decided to go to these royal colonies in the South, thinking about North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. They believed that they wanted to have a large plots of land. They would bring even more African slaves to these plantations, these new plantations that they established. And this is really the beginning of what we kind of consider to be Southern hospitality, the behavior that we sort of have in our minds as a stereotypical Southerner begins right off the bat, right off with the new colonies, because these folks, because they grew up in noble society in England, they had their own they had their view of how people should behave, how people should act around each other. So this whole stereotype of Southern society begins as it began. As soon as people from England came to these colonies, this is how they acted. The folks who came into what's called the borderlanders of the English colonies, which are now considered the Appalachian Mountains, were far less noble. They were poor farmers from primarily Scotland and Ireland, and they would become the eventual pioneers who wanted to continue to move west. And when the French and Indian War occurred, they were the people who wanted to continue to move west. They wanted to move into the farmlands of the Great Plains that England was able to win from the French. There was also the colony of Maryland that was established by the Lord of Baltimore, who wanted to create a colony that was primarily for Catholics. He was willing to accept Catholics, or I'm sorry, willing to accept Protestants into Maryland, but he wanted to make sure that the Catholic religion was respected there. This unfortunately does not last long. The family of Charles Calvert, who were the Lords of Baltimore, begin to allow for things to get out of hand in terms of violence. So as soon as the king sees that there's violence within his colonies, he needs to step in. And he requires the Calvert family, the Lords of Baltimore, to not allow Catholics to practice their religion out in the open. They must now be more private. They must be not show that they are Catholics, or show that they are having Catholic services. Because even then, there's still a lot of distrust between Catholics and all the Protestant religions. There's still a lot of violence. There's still a lot of hatred between those two groups. Today, that is non-existent. Christianity is considered to be sort of it can be all of those religions between Catholics and Protestants. At this time, that does not occur. The last kind of colony breakdown is that of one second. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So the last set of colonies is that of the Puritans at Plymouth Rock, and the uniqueness of the Quakers in Pennsylvania is particularly highlighted when we think about the Puritans. If you know the story about the Puritans, though, those who know the stories from Thanksgiving, know that that the Puritans were not well liked, were not protected by the English. So that's why they wanted to move to the English colonies in order to practice their religion. And they were able to do that in Plymouth. That they were able to practice their religion. They were able to educate their children in sort of religious doctrine. However, they have very little respect and are willing to give much freedom to those who did not follow their religion. So there are stories of people who decide to challenge Puritan faith are actually exiled, are actually kicked out of the Plymouth Rock and eventually Massachusetts Bay Colony because they do not follow the Puritan faith. That is how the colony of Rhode Island and Connecticut both become colonies out of folks who are banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, because the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because Plymouth Rock was not a royal or corporate colony, these Puritans were able to set up their own government. And before they even left their ship, before they even left the Mayflower, they created a government. They created the Mayflower Compact, which would become their charter. And they created a representative democracy in which majority rule, and that they were able to govern their own. They were able to govern their society. And even though it was majority rule, they did still create requirements of those who could vote, who could be part of the government. And it was primarily men, and it was primarily those who were of the Puritan faith, who had sort of the who professed themselves to be Puritans. The most famous governor of Massachusetts, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was John Winthrop. He eventually established a representative democracy, or a representative body for the state or for the colony. So that is sort of a overview of our colonies, of the beginning of the colonies. And now we come to sort of the fraying, the continued fraying between the English colonies and the English government. And it comes over taxation. So as I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, there was this war between the French and the British that occurs not just in the American colonies, but really all across the world. The French and the British were in a massive, really first world war over new colonies and over the land that both countries held across the country or across the world. So in the Americas, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia as well. The British and the French are going after each other in these wars. And eventually, the British do win. And in particular, in the American colonies, they actually are able to double in size their colonial government or their colonial land in the Americas. And once this happens, the British government realizes how expensive it's going to be to control and govern over these lands, and more importantly, to protect these lands. So they realize that they have to not only have governments across these societies, across these colonies, but they also have to make sure they protect them. They know that still the French hold land in North America. They know the Spanish hold land in North America and other parts of the Americas. So they begin, and Parliament particularly begins to decide how are we going to pay for this, and they make a decision that almost makes sense if we want to think about it. They say, you know what, since we're spending, the money that we now have to spend are for the colonists, are for our colonies. So in order for us to do this, we need to actually tax the colonists. We're not going to tax the people in England anymore. They're taxed enough; they get the services that they need. For the colonists to get the services they need, we need to tax them more. And before this time frame, the colonists they're taxed just like every other British citizen, and the English government, the Parliament, the King, generally leave them alone. The Virginia colony, it becomes more and more colonial rule. Each colony is able to run their own government. As soon as the British start deciding that they need to tax more, they take more and more authority from these colonial governments and begin to tax more. So the Parliament first starts off with what's called the Stamp Act. That every legal document, every document in general that needs to be stamped by the British government to give it authority has an extra tax. This becomes incredibly unpopular, becomes incredibly costly, and the colonists protest. The colonists come out in violence over this form of this new tax. So the British actually decide to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, but then they replace it with the Declaratory Act, which gives Great Britain the right to make any laws they wish to regulate the colonies. It's basically the Parliament saying, well, okay, we'll remove the Stamp Act, but just know we're still able to tax you. You still are under our authority. So the Parliament continues to create taxes. And the next form of tax was the Townshend Acts. And it was established by the new finance minister from Great Britain, Charles Townshend. And it essentially creates new taxes of a lot of different things that colonists have to buy from the British. So everything that is sent from England to the colonies, or anything sent from the colonies to anywhere else. So thinking about the fact that England uses their empire to essentially make for business. So the goods that are grown in the American colonies can go to England to be processed. Items that are made in India or Africa can be sent to the Americas in order for those to be sold. So all of that begins to be taxed by the British, and everything outside of the British Empire, anything that the American colonists buy from the French colonies or from Spain or from other countries in England, those have even larger taxes to make the colonists buy more from Britain. This brings about even more protests by the colonists, and in particular in Boston, in Massachusetts. And this brings about both the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Massacre was particularly a protest of the Townshend Acts, in which British soldiers opened fire on the protesters. One person was killed, but it was still labeled as a massacre by many of the colonial papers, those who supported the protests by the colonists. The Tea Party was over the taxing of tea coming to the Americas. When the British found out about this Boston Tea Party, in which sons of the American Revolution, dressed up as Native Americans, jumped on British ships and tossed over the tea, basically ruining the tea, the British Parliament signs up on the Intolerable Acts, basically shutting down the Boston Harbor and enforcing new laws and enforcing a new government onto the British colonies. So now all of a sudden, the colonists feel trapped. They feel as if, we came to this country, we came to these new colonies, but we come from a free nation. We come from a government that is free. We come from a society that's free. We come from a government that is responsive to its citizens. Parliament is not being responsive to the American colonists at this point. So these are all actions that lead many Americans, many of the new colonists, to choose to wage a revolution against the British. That is what we come to in the final section of the origins of American government, and that we will cover in the near future. With that, are there any questions? No questions at this point. What I'll do, I'll stay online for the next 10 minutes or so. While I'm doing that, I will bring up the contact information that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. That I again do apologize that many of you did not get to see. But here is again the options of communication. Please use whatever ones that you feel are best for you. And myself, the rest of the education staff will be more than happy to help you out. But if you do have questions, you can certainly type them in, and I will do my best to answer them. But I do want to thank you all. Thank you for your attendance and your participation. Like I said, if you do have questions, feel free to write them in. And for the next 10 minutes, I'll be more than happy to answer. But again, thank you so much, and good luck with your program.